Hey, what is up everyone? This past summer we got a new set of Tall Tales added to Sea of Thieves, so I figured in this video it would be a good time to go ahead and rank all the Tall Tales we have in the game. With the Legend of Monkey Island crossover, it now brings our total amount of Tall Tales to 20 in the game. So starting out with our quote-unquote worst Tall Tale at number 20, it's the Legendary Storyteller. Now, honestly, I don't think this is terrible in the sense of it's a horrible experience to play, but it's just very lackluster and kind of boring. I feel like a lot of the early Tall Tales, kind of before they knew what they were doing with it, they kind of had the idea of they wanted to make story content, but they didn't really have the gameplay nailed down too much yet. So the Legendary Storyteller, it's honestly just a very basic, boring voyage. You have to go to different parts of the map and just dig up different things, and really that's essentially it. I never really found this one too interesting. It's not difficult to do or anything like that, it's really just kind of boring. And I'm not going to hold it against the early Tall Tales, but I will say one thing that kind of hurt it in terms of me remembering back on it is that if you wanted to 100% complete the original set of Tall Tales with the Shores of Gold arc, you had to do the Tall Tales 5 times, which was a ridiculous accommodation for them to put in. But if you wanted to finish everything and get the gold curse and all that stuff, you had to do them 5 times. So just that alone made some of them that I didn't like really doing, made them even worse just because they forced you to keep replaying it if you want to finish everything. Moving on to number 19, this is the Art of the Trickster. So honestly, in some ways, this one I hate a little bit more. But the reason I put it above the Legendary Storyteller was, at least with this one, they did some unique stuff with it. So we had some unique ways of doing things. We had the telescope that you look through and you have to match that with something else, and then that showed you where to dig up. I thought that was pretty interesting that they did that. And then also just the island that they have where you can go through all the traps and stuff. That was really cool. Really, it's after that part that I get annoyed because I'm sorry, honestly, it's been a while since I played this and I really did not want to replay it for this video. But basically, I remember doing it. You get through the whole tunnel with all the traps and stuff. Then you had to do this whole big fight down there. And then you had to do a bunch of other stuff going to another island before you can complete the Tall Tale. For this one, it was some nice, unique things that they did with it. I really liked the addition they did with the island at Sailor's Bounty. But in general, I felt like it just wasted a lot of time having you had to sail back and forth to a bunch of different places, when it really would have been cool if they just kind of slimmed it down a bit and had it end where you did that whole battle underneath the island in the caves. So that's just my thought with it. I think it could have been a really great Tall Tale if it was just trimmed up a little bit. So moving on to number 18, we have the Maiden Voyage. So this one technically counts as a Tall Tale, even though most of us just think of it as the tutorial mode. So the fact that it's a tutorial mode and it's not really a Tall Tale in the sense of the way we think about it, in terms of there being some kind of story and that kind of stuff, is why it's ranked a bit lower. However, I do like a lot of the Maiden Voyage, just in terms of, you get to see the Pirate Lord and, interact with him a good amount. There's all the little secrets around that island. It's, it's its own custom island, basically, that you can't access to the main Sea of Thieves game, which is one step above some of these other Tall Tales, where, especially the older ones, where they were basically inside the main Sea of Thieves world, and some of it were just kind of doing the regular stuff, kind of like the Legendary Storyteller, where there wasn't really anything new with it in terms of locations to go to. So the Maiden Voyage was cool, that it was, huge, unique island. You got to see some cool little Easter eggs. And in terms of the original set of Tall Tales, because I'm kind of including that with this, because they came out around the same time, this one had the most fun accommodations, in my opinion, to complete. Most of the other accommodations for the other Tall Tales were find a certain amount of journals on different islands, complete the Tall Tale 5 times, and a few other things. But I don't think it's a bad Tall Tale. I think it kind of hurts when you're trying to replay it, because really it is just a tutorial mode. But in general, I don't have a problem with this one. Alright, moving on to number 17. This was where we really started seeing the Tall Tales get a lot better in terms of having interesting gameplay, as well as good story, and just everything that makes a Tall Tale good. number 17 is kind of where that starts happening. So at number 17 we have the Shroudbreaker. This is essentially the first Tall Tale we've ever had, not including the Maiden Voyage, since that's a little bit of iffy if you really want to count that as a Tall Tale. The Shroudbreaker was a nice introduction to the story. I feel like maybe there was too many Tall Tales for this story arc, because I feel like it had an interesting premise, but then it kind of got dragged on a little bit. But in general, I think it's a nice introduction. There's nothing too unique with it. I really like the stuff talking to the mysterious stranger. I thought that was pretty cool, because he's one of those NPCs that you don't really interact with too much in the game. So having him as like the introduction to all this was really cool. And then another thing that I liked was this was the first time we saw the inside of the vaults, which would later become the ancient vaults that we had in the game, as well as being used in other Tall Tales. So all of that together, I thought was a pretty cool experience. So at number 16 we have the Cursed Rogue. So I like this one, I think mainly because I like talking to Madame Olivia. The Madame Olivia stuff was cool. This one had a boss battle with Briggsy in her skeleton form, so that was another thing that was really cool with this one. And in general, I actually feel like this one had a pretty good pacing for the Tall Tale. It didn't feel like it dragged on too long, as opposed to some of the other ones like we talked about with the Legendary Storyteller or the Art of the Trickster. This one I felt like was really well paced in terms of, how much time you're spending on it. At number 15 we have the Fate of the Morningstar. So this one's an interesting one, because something that you will notice with the original set of Tall Tales is that while it was telling one overarching story, there was lots of mini kind of like side stories that were going on throughout the Tall Tales. So the Fate of the Morningstar set up one of these side arcs with the Morningstar crew, and this later played a part in future Tall Tales outside of the Shores of Gold arc. So in terms of setting stuff up and having an interesting story, I like this a lot. I also enjoyed some of the unique items that we got to use inside this Tall Tale, like with the Ferryman's Lantern. That was a really unique and interesting thing to have in this. Moving on to number 14, we have Revenge of the Morningstar. So this is what came directly after the Fate of the Morningstar. I like this one a lot because it had some cool things that you got to do with it. Like you got to dress up in a disguise as the Morningstar crew, and then you could go talk to NPCs and they give you a little bit different dialogue than before. I thought that was a unique little touch of like kind of, fitting that Sea of Thieves world and experience, where you got to be kind of sneaky and tricking, the NPCs kind of in there. And I thought all that was really fun to do. This one also had another boss battle at the end. I think I prefer the Briggsy boss battle a little bit better to this one. I think maybe it just is because you fight Grey Marrow doing like the Fort of the Dam and other stuff, so it's not as unique to fight him here. But in general, this is a pretty solid Tall Tale. Moving on to number 13, we have Stars of a Thief. So this one is one that I really like the gameplay of. I really enjoyed the telescope that they did with this one. So this telescope, basically you could look up at the stars in the game and you'd be able to see constellations in there, and basically would tell you different things and how to do certain stuff throughout your adventure. And I just thought that was a really unique concept, and I really loved the way it looked, looking up at the stars and seeing the constellations form and everything. It was just a very cool experience. I think one of the best things these Tall Tales did was just give you unique experiences that you couldn't get anywhere else inside the game, whether it's using unique items or going to cool or in special locations that maybe wouldn't have fit within the main adventure game. So at number 12 we have the Wild Rose. So with this one, unlike the previous one, if I were basing this just off of gameplay, it probably wouldn't have ranked as high, because the gameplay is somewhat basic. It's kind of similar to some of the earlier Tall Tales that we talked about. But the thing I really like with this one is the story that they told. So it's a very self-contained story. It's a bit of a romance story, and it's about like kind of two souls that were meant to be together, and trying to reconnect them and all that kind of stuff. And just in general, I thought it was a very nice little story that they told. And out of all the original set of Tall Tales, this is one that I don't mind replaying multiple times, because it wasn't too long of a Tall Tale. So that's always a benefit in my book, because I don't like having my time wasted. And, just all the story moments and like the quote-unquote cutscenes and little moments that you have with all the characters are just all worked really well in this Tall Tale. I think this is something that if they were to do more Tall Tales in the future that maybe weren't as expansive as some of the ones we're going to talk about in a moment, this is a good step, because this is kind of like a smaller Tall Tale, I think. Alright, as we move on to number 11, I think this is where we're going to start getting into some of the more controversial takes that people are going to either really agree with me or maybe will very heavily disagree with me. And I'm very interested to hear what y'all's rankings would be in the comments below. So number 11 is The Quest for Guybrush. So this is the second Tall Tale from the Monkey Island trilogy of Tall Tales that we had gotten this past summer. And while I did have some unique gameplay with the insult sword fighting, and honestly that's it, that was pretty much the unique gameplay, but I will say, so I did enjoy the addition of the insult sword fighting that we got in this Tall Tale, as well as the addition of zip lines that were brought in with this Tall Tale. But other than that, the main problem that I have with this Tall Tale is just how much time it wastes for the player to play this one. This is probably the longest Tall Tale out of all the Tall Tales in the game. It might be beat by one or two others that I'm thinking of in my mind that we haven't talked about yet. But in general, this is a very long Tall Tale, and it feels like it. The way that the gameplay and the story is broken up here just makes it feel like you're wasting a lot of time on stuff that's not that interesting. But one of the biggest compliments I will say in terms of this Tall Tale is the island itself. So this Tall Tale takes place on Melee Island, and I just think Melee Island is one of the most beautiful islands that Sea of Thieves has made, especially with that moonlight that's just always shining and the way that it looks across the entire island. It all just looks really great. However, the only reason that might not bring it up any higher in this list is because technically the island was introduced in the first Tall Tale. So in terms of like which one gets the points for having the new island, it would be going to the other one. But before we talk about that Tall Tale, let's talk about our number 10 spot, which is the Lair of LeChuck. So the Lair of LeChuck is the final part of the Legend of the Monkey Island Tall Tales, and this one, if you saw my review for it, you know I didn't really like it that much. There were aspects of it that I did like, but similar to the Quest for Guybrush that we just talked about, it just takes up so much of your time, and in my opinion, it's just not that fun. The way that it just drags out so much stuff, when if you really took that Tall Tale, you could cut a good amount of it down, and it would be so much more fun. It would be the same gameplay and everything that you're doing, but it just wouldn't be wasting so much time. And that's really the biggest problem with this Tall Tale. It's not really anything else. It's not, the gameplay is fine. If you're playing solo, I found out that this Tall Tale was a lot more difficult. Basically, every Tall Tale that we have in the game is perfectly fine to do solo or with a bunch of friends. But this Tall Tale specifically, the ending is kind of difficult to do by yourself. So keep that in mind. That was another point that I didn't like because I play most of this stuff solo. So there's just a lot of stuff with this Tall Tale, but kind of similar to the compliments that I had for the Quest of Guybrush, I really like the island they made in this Tall Tale. I think Monkey Island's a really cool setting to experience and run around in. I don't think I like it as much as Melee Island. I think Melee Island is just a bit better, but Monkey Island's really cool, and the cutscene that you have at the end at the church scene is probably my favorite cinematic that we have of all of these Tall Tales. It's a really cool cutscene if you haven't seen it yet, and I don't want to spoil too much of it in case someone is watching this and they haven't finished these Tall Tales. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But let's move on to our number 9 spot, and you might be able to guess what this one is if you kind of picked up on the trend. This one at number 9 is The Journey to Melee Island. So you can see that I didn't really like the Monkey Island Tall Tales too much, and I'm going to talk about some of the stuff I really liked with it and why I put the first Tall Tale at the top of these 3. So The Journey to Melee Island is our introduction to this whole Tall Tale story. One problem I do see going forward with these Tall Tales that I didn't necessarily have a problem with, but I do think it's going to be a problem with replayability for people that, start the game later or whatever the case may be. The story for the Monkey Island Tall Tales was set up in an adventure that came out the month before the Journey to Melee Island came out. You cannot replay that adventure. So if you're confused as to why are these characters here, what is going on, what is that sword that LeChuck's holding, what is the significance of it, why does he keep changing it back and forth to look like the Pirate Lord, a lot of those questions were answered in that adventure. So if you didn't get to play through that, you're going to be a bit lost when you're going into this. So I think that's a big negative for all these Tall Tales, just because the setup to the story is no longer playable and new players won't be able to experience that. But then if we're talking about the story in general, the storyline that's going across these three Tall Tales just isn't that interesting or cohesive enough in my opinion, as opposed to some of the other Tall Tales, whether it's the original set of Tall Tales, even the side stories that we talked about, like the Morningstar Tall Tales, or what we'll talk about towards the end of this list. There's a lot of things that it failed upon, in my opinion, that made it not make it higher in this list. However, there's a lot of good quality with these Tall Tales, which is why I think it deserves to be put kind of in this middle area. So that was some of the stuff that I didn't like. What I did really like is the islands, of course, I've talked about that, but the voice dialogue is really what makes these Tall Tales special. It's really the only place in Sea of Thieves where you can talk to any character and they have voice dialogue and they're talking to you. And, you know, we've seen characters talk in Sea of Thieves before, but if you were to try to do any more dialogue with them, it's just reading text on the screen. And if there's anything for Sea of Thieves to pull from these Monkey Island Tall Tales, is that us players loved having the voice dialogue. So I'm hoping that if we get more story content in the future, which I'm assuming we will, I don't think there's any reason why they'd stop doing it. I hope that they kind of follow the Monkey Island route and have voice dialogue instead of just reading text on the screen. In terms of the journey to Melee Island specifically, I think it was actually a pretty good start to these Monkey Island Tall Tales. The Monkey Island Tall Tales actually have a pretty unique gameplay style as opposed to all the other Tall Tales that we've been talking about, because it's more similar to the point and click adventures but in like a 3D setting that the Tall Tales are based off of, as opposed to say the normal Sea of Thieves gameplay. So I really enjoyed that, and I think with the journey to Melee Island, just completing it, it felt very natural. The story progression and like the gameplay progression made sense. I never had to like look inside the book or open a guide or anything to complete it. It just, you know, we were kind of following things through and like, oh, well, I found this thing. Oh wait, this person's saying they need this thing, and oh, we need to go find whatever this part is, and all just that kind of stuff. And it was fun solving these puzzles, and it felt very self-contained, and it made sense, and we were able to kind of progress through it. It didn't feel like there was time being wasted, even though we did spend a lot of time in this Tall Tale. If you're comparing it to, say, the Quest for Guybrush or the Lair of LeChuck, I actually felt the time draining while I was playing those, whereas when I'm playing the Journey to Melee Island, I don't really feel like I'm wasting my time. It just feels like I'm kind of having fun progressing, and I think that was the biggest key. So it was a really good introduction. I feel like the following two Tall Tales kind of failed in terms of keeping that momentum and keeping that excitement, but I think it's a pretty solid Tall Tale. I mean, it's made it to number 9 on this list, so I don't hate it or anything. I think there's some really good parts, and I think it just has some poor sequels. It's kind of like the sequel trilogy to Star Wars. The Force Awakens wasn't too bad, but it's the ones that came after it that kind of brought it down a bit. Moving on to our number 8 spot, these final Tall Tales that we're talking about are my favorite in the game. I really enjoy replaying them and all that stuff. So, as opposed to everything else we've talked about, I don't like to go back and replay the other stuff that we've gone through so far. These final 8, I do go back routinely and keep doing them. At number 8, we have the Seabound Soul. So after the Shores of Gold arc, they basically did these two Tall Tales together that acted as their own little mini self-contained story, and it teed up some other stuff that came later. So the story that was told with the Seabound Soul I thought was pretty interesting, and it ended up with us releasing Flameheart. And I think that was just a very interesting thing for the Sea of Thieves world. Obviously, in retrospect, Flameheart's impact hasn't been that much yet. We had the world events, which was really cool, and we had his soldiers with the Ashen Lords come in. But in terms of doing something with him personally, we haven't seen much yet after we freed him last year in the adventure that we had with whether we choose between Pendragon and Flameheart. So I'm very interested to see what happens with him going forward. But this Tall Tale is really what set all of that up. It's what brought Flameheart into the world and made the rest of this possible. So in terms of impact to the game, this Tall Tale is very significant to Sea of Thieves. So moving on to number 7, we have A Pirate's Life. And this Tall Tale is the start of the Pirates of the Caribbean Tall Tales that we got in the game. And I think it's a very solid introduction. I actually think the Journey to Melee Island was a better introduction to that story arc. But the Pirate's Life Tall Tale is a very solid introduction. And it was unique because it was one of the first times we actually used the portals to go to another world and travel through stuff. And if you're someone like me who's a big fan of both the Pirates of the Caribbean movies as well as the ride in Disney World, you have found a lot of Easter eggs with all these Tall Tales, but especially this one and another one that we'll talk about in a moment, that they had just tons of Easter eggs that if you are a fan, you really would enjoy. Moving on to number 6, we have the Sunken Pearl. So this one I think is really solid in terms of gameplay. This is the second of the Pirates of the Caribbean Tall Tales. And this one had us swimming all the way down, and this was our first glimpse of the Sunken Kingdom. So in terms of impact to the game, this one is significant as well because it introduced us to the entire Sunken Kingdom. I really enjoyed the battle that we had with the Kraken. You actually got to see like the face of the Kraken, and it was just very spooky down there, dealing with the Siren Queen, and just all that stuff in general I felt was really cool. At number 5, we have Lords of the Sea. So this is the finale to the Pirates of the Caribbean Tall Tales, and this one ironically is kind of the opposite problem that I have with every other Tall Tale and basically everything in Sea of Thieves. This one felt like a little bit short for a finale. I think it was a pretty decent finale. So you go in, you have this giant ship battle, and you fight Davy Jones's ship and all that stuff, and then you rush into the tower and, you know, do stuff in the tower to basically take him down, and you get to board the Black Pearl at the end of it. So there was a lot of cool moments in this. I just think the next Tall Tales that we're going to be talking about are a lot better. So taking a bit of a departure from the Pirates of the Caribbean Tall Tales that we just talked about, the Shores of Gold is, like the name would imply, the finale to the Shores of Gold arc that started all the Tall Tales in Sea of Thieves. So the Shores of Gold is a really solid Tall Tale. It does a lot of things that are really cool, like having a unique island and having a really, probably one of our best boss fights in the game, and just unique settings. A lot of great stuff in this. I will say it does drag on certain parts, especially when you first get to the Shores of Gold and you have to go to each of the different towers and get 4 medallions before you can get to the really fun stuff. So that's a bit of a drag. I think that was really designed for crews of 4. If you're playing solo or even duo, this part takes a long time to do. So that's not enjoyable. I wish there was a way to kind of skip past that part if you've already done it. But everything else is really amazing. Once you get down to the caverns of the Shores of Gold Island, it is really cool with basically you have to jump through traps and there's enemies to fight and you have to lift drawbridges. And in terms of like kind of like the parkour type stuff, if you're someone that likes doing that kind of thing, this Tall Tale is a lot of fun. And just the environment down there is really amazing. Like, I remember this one part, and it took my friend a very long time to get through it. But it's basically you're going on these broken masts that are over like a huge cavern of spikes, and you can't see anything, so you have to have your lantern out so that you can actually see where you're going. And just that alone, it's just such a cool experience. I'd love to have more stuff like that because it makes you feel very tense down there. And I kind of like that feeling. It's kind of like the same feeling you'd have like watching a horror movie or a thriller or something. And then the boss battle at the end of this is a really great boss battle in terms of where you're fighting the Gold Hoarder, and he has unique movesets compared to the other Skeleton Lords that you fought in the game. And then just that, basically the arena that you're in with all the gold covering the floor. And the way that ends when you defeat the Gold Hoarder and you're talking to the Pirate Lord, and you have like, he does the magical thing up in the sky, and you kind of look at all the stuff that you've done to get to this moment. It just felt like a very rewarding experience. So this Tall Tale did a really good job of wrapping up the original set of Tall Tales and making it feel like an earned moment getting to that point. So honestly, other than having to get those 4 medallions at the beginning that, felt like it wasted a lot of time, this Tall Tale is almost flawless. So I really enjoy the Shores of Gold. Moving on to our number 3 spot, this is the Heart of Fire. So this is by far one of my favorite Tall Tales. I absolutely love this Tall Tale. Until we got to the Pirates of the Caribbean stuff, this was, what I would have called the best Tall Tale ever made. This one, like the Shores of Gold, had you going into this unique little cavernous area where you're doing like parkour type stuff. You have things swinging that are trying to hit you and all sorts of, interesting stuff. But you also have the aesthetic of it all being lava down there. And this continues on with the Seabound Soul, continuing the Flameheart story. And the one thing that puts this above the Shores of Gold, one, there's less BS trying to get to the fun part of the Tall Tale with this one, as well as I think the story is a bit more interesting to follow with this, where you're seeing what's happening in the Stitcher Gym and all sorts of stuff, how it's building up with Flameheart and what he's doing in the background. And if I'm remembering this right, it did actually help set up some of the stuff with the Reaper's Bones going forward. So this is another one that had a big impact on the rest of the game. So I really liked all of that. And just in general, this is just a really solid Tall Tale and has one of the best environments of all these Tall Tales. Moving on to a number 2 spot, we have the Dark Brethren. So this one's a really cool one. I think it has unique gameplay. You have like the water slides that you're going down. You're going to the Coral Fortress, which is somewhat off the map, which that was cool to visit. And honestly, this one is one of those that I really like the story and the gameplay of, which is why it's kind of set above a lot of the other stuff that we have on this list. Just the idea of having basically like a Sea of Thieves version of like the Sinister Six, where you have the Gold Hoarder, and you have Davy Jones, and you have Wanda, and you have Duke. All these people coming together and basically making their own evil group to fight the rest of us off is just a really cool concept, and being able to sneak around them and, keep an eye on them, fighting with Captain Jack Sparrow. And I really enjoyed this one a lot. I think the gameplay is really solid. Getting to board Davy Jones' ship and play the piano on his ship like in the movies was really awesome. And honestly, Sea of Thieves really nailed both the gameplay and the story with these Pirates of the Caribbean Tall Tales, which is why all of them have made it up to the top of this list. Speaking of the top of this list, at number 1, we have Captains of the Dam. So this one might be somewhat surprising to some people. I feel like some people might think that the Lords of the Sea is the best one. Others might think that the Heart of Fire or the Shores of Gold is the best one. The reason I put the Captains of the Dam one is I think it just feels so unique, and I really enjoy going through the the swampy area and hearing, like, seeing all the little Easter eggs to Pirates of the Caribbean, and especially that town that you go to in the second part of this Tall Tale, where you're fighting the ghost phantoms and everything's crumbling around on you, and just all that was really cool. And also just seeing the ghost bar where you have like all these people hanging out there, and I think that was really a cool experience to go look around in, I guess. This one for me is just more of like, I'm a big fan of Pirates of the Caribbean, so just being able to see like a lot of the references. There's literally a part of this Tall Tale where you can basically go on your own little boat ride, just like the ride in Disney World. So that's just really cool. Being able to explore these locations is a lot of fun. But that covers every Tall Tale in Sea of Thieves. Honestly, with these kind of rankings, sometimes my rankings might change over time. This is just how it is right now. I'd love to hear what y'all think about this ranking, and how would you rank all the Tall Tales that we have in the game. Let me know all that in the comments below, but if you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you hit the like and subscribe. And one thing to note, I will be making an updated version of my Tall Tale cosmetic ranking video, which is one of my most popular videos on the channel. I'll be making an updated version of that to include all the new Tall Tale cosmetics that we've gotten recently. So keep a lookout for that in the future. But until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all later. Bye y'all.